I don't know how many of the dead appeared before I started to take notice. It started small, insects. No matter where I went in my new house, I'd come across a dead fly or spider. The house may have been new to me, but it's been built decades ago. A bit of a pest problem was to be expected. I wasn't even really bothered the first time I saw a dead mouse, but the dead kept getting bigger. After a few mice, I graduated up to the big old disgusting rat. The one that really got to me was the cat. It was a mangy thing. Clearly its last moments weren't its best. I came home from work and found the poor little creature stiff as a board laying on my kitchen floor. I buried it in the backyard. When I got home from work the next day, I was startled by a loud thud coming up from upstairs. It was like a large sack of potatoes falling from a hook. A crash of something heavy just completely giving out all at once. Everything upstairs, and I had to check every room twice. Just when I was about to give up, I saw the drawstring which lowered the stairs to the attic. So I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up. It only took a moment to stop and spot the dead human body. It was lucky that the man died when he did. If I hadn't heard him fall to the floor, it might have been weeks before I discovered his body. He was a homeless man. The cops searched the attic thoroughly and said he couldn't have been living up there for very long. There weren't any signs of it, at least. They guessed he probably broke in to try and escape a cold for a few hours, and he just never left. When I told them about the cat, they agreed to my hypothesis that it belonged to the homeless man. It was sad, really. Like an elderly couple married for decades, suddenly dying one after another in close succession. With his cat gone and buried, he must not have felt the need to keep going on. You would think that the death of the homeless man inside my home would drive me from the place, but it was quite the opposite. While the shock of the event had deeply affected me, I felt compelled to stay in the house rather than flee from this recent tragedy. I took the week off work, but didn't leave my house once. I didn't do a whole lot during that week. It was like a break from reality. I quietly made tea and would sit on my couch staring at the wall for hours, lost in my own thoughts. The only real break was from the frequent shouting matches overheard from next door. The middle-aged couple next door had been fighting since I moved in. Things had really ramped up during that week, though. I'd hear yelling and slamming doors all the time. It was only natural that the couple who disrupted my peaceful meditation would also be responsible for driving me from my house. I was drawn out of my thoughts one night by the squealing tires of a car quickly accelerating. A few minutes later, there was a frantic knock at my front door. I opened it to find the wife from next door. Tears streamed down her face from two bruised eyes. She apologized for imposing on a stranger, but practically begged me for help. She didn't know how long her husband would be gone, but she needed help to escape his marriage. To escape this marriage, For the first time in a week, my own troubles vanished from my mind, and I sprung into action to help someone. We rushed back to her house, and she quickly packed her things. I helped her carry the bags and load them into my cars as nosy neighbors watched from their windows. We rode in silence to a shelter where I hoped she could get the help she needed. For the first time since the homeless man's death, I felt good. It was refreshing to be out again, and I feared falling back into that trance-like state I had spent the last weekend if I returned home too soon. So I got a bite to eat and even saw a movie. When I returned home, her corpse was on my couch. I stared at it a few minutes, completely dumbfounded before my mind started to race. There weren't any sign of a struggle in my house or visible injuries on the woman, besides those I had already seen when she first arrived at my door, but it was clear she was dead. No rise or fall on her chest, skin was pale and eyes open but unmoving. There was no sign at all which would indicate how she died, or, more importantly, for me at least, how she ended up in my living room. I don't know how long I took to stand there and staring at her dead body, but once again it was heavy pounding at my front door which brought me back to reality. I heard the all too familiar screams of my next door neighbor, the dead woman's husband. He was relentlessly banging on the door and screaming that he knew I was in there with his wife. It all began to click. He did this. I didn't know how, but it was the only possible explanation. One of the other neighbors had seen me leave with his wife, and I must have told him. Somehow he had tracked her down, murdered her, and snuck the body into my house. It didn't really make sense, but it was the best I could come up with. The pounding on the door didn't stop. I feared that he would soon break it down, and I'd be joining his wife on the list of murder victims that night. Luckily, one of the nosy neighbors came to my rescue and must have called the cops. The sound of sirens outside was music to my ears. The sound of sirens outside was music to my ears. I watched through the peephole as the police talked the madman down, handcuffed him, and led him back towards one of their cruisers. The man broke down in drunken tears and blabbered about how he just wanted to know where I took his wife so he could give her the proper apology and promised he'd start to turn things around. A few moments later, he was placed in the back seat and one of the cops was knocking at my door. He wanted to come in for a moment and give my statement. My eyes darted toward my living room, which was right around the corner and still contained a dead body. It was about then that the husband's words really started to click with me. He spoke about the future he wanted with his wife. Starting over, quitting alcohol, and going to get help with his rage issues. Not exactly the words you'd expect if they knew their wife was already dead by their own hands. No, I told the police officer. I think I'd rather come outside, get some fresh air. This whole thing was pretty scary. I slipped out the door and shut it tight, praying that the officer would not force me to let him inside. Thankfully, he didn't have any issue with it. The husband away, as I told the end of the story to a note-taking officer. I guess cops are used to people being uncomfortable because he didn't seem to have any problem with my horrible uneasiness. After what seemed like hours, he thanked me, handed me his card, and he left. My mind was racing. I just covered up a possible homicide. I had stood there speaking to a cop for ages and failed to mention that there was a dead woman inside sitting on my couch. I turned the business card over in my hands as I contemplated calling him back to explain everything. He needed to know about the dead body that just appeared in my house. But I ultimately decided against it and felt like I should go back inside and really make sure I was clear on the details before telling anyone about this absurd situation. I didn't have to return to the living room to come face to face with the dead this time. When I opened the door, I saw that the dead woman had been joined by her husband. His corpse was laid out in my foyer. I jumped into the house and slammed the door behind me, not wanting to give my neighbors a chance to see what I was seeing. Another corpse. This time the man that had just been driven away in the back of the police car. I paced back and forth down the hallway to the living room. The recently dead husband and wife didn't move a muscle. How? So I could keep asking myself. How had he died? How did the corpse end up here? How was any of this possible? Were the cops in on it? Was I somehow being framed for a double murder? Panicked, I ran out the back door to try and get some air to collect my thoughts. I collapsed into a wicker chair and ran my hands through my sweat-drenched hair. Once more I was drawn from my thoughts by an unwelcome sound. The neighbor's dog was growling at me. Not the dead neighbor's, the dog that belonged to the neighbor on the other side of the house. This dog, Pepper I believe was his name, had always been the sweetest little thing. I never heard so much as a yelp from him before. He was a fixture of the neighborhood. The dog growling at me like I was trying to tear his pups limb from limb. I rushed back inside. I found Pepper laying on the floor next to the dead husband. His tongue had rolled out of his mouth and the vacant stare of death on his face. Confused more than anything, I returned to the back door and moved the curtain so I could see. Pepper was also still there on the other side of my neighbor's chain-link fence. I could even make out the sound of his growling, yet his corpse also decorated my floor. When the realtor first showed the house to me, there were two things that made me hesitant about purchasing it. One was the age of the house. The other was the unfinished dirt basement. It now seemed that the dirt basement was my salvation. I buried the bodies down there. All three of them. It was a long night. It got easier as time went on. It feels strange to say it, but I got pretty efficient at burying corpses. Each night I left the house, I would return to find the dead. I tried to limit how often I left. Started using vacation days like I was going out of style and I had everything I needed to deliver to the house. I tried to act like everything was normal, but it kept getting worse. One night, I fumbled my keys upon returning to the house and I could hear it inside. The footsteps walking around the hallway. The second I opened the door, the person dropped dead and fell to the floor like my very presence had killed them. At first I thought it was random. Who would be dead? But then I realized that I knew in each and every one of them. My angry neighbor died a few more times in the house. Next door, he got back together with his wife a few weeks after I had driven her to the shelter. They still fought, but less often and less violent. If it was the real ones living next door, I had no idea what was buried in my basement. Sometimes I'd return home to find a dead relative or a friend from high school. I once held a phone conversation with a cousin while at the same time burying their body in the basement. I realized that I even recognized the homeless man that cat that started this all. The day before the cat died, I had stopped on the street to drop $1 into his empty coffee cup as he panhandled, cat in hand. None of it made any sense, but for the sake of my own sanity, I just tried to accept my new living situation, and the notebook in the basement helped to explain a little. As I was digging a grave for my second-grade teacher, I struck something solid under the dirt. After a bit of work, I uncovered a small wooden chest. Inside the chest was a notebook. I gave up on grave digging for the night and returned upstairs to my dirt-stained living room to read the whole thing in one sitting. It had been left there by the previous owner of the house. He introduced himself as David. It turned out he too was running an unlicensed cemetery in the basement. He recounted his years in the house, and it all sounded remarkably similar to my own. It started small, but before long he was overwhelmed with the human corpses this house seemed to create. As best as he could tell from years of dealing with the problem, the house would latch on to whatever was in the forefront of your mind. It created them, and then when it could no longer hold control of the body, it would die. This usually took place when a stronger presence, i.e. an actual living individual, entered the house. It seemed he was prepared to go on living like this for some time. He talked about how he had already dug back up earlier graves and exhumed bodies so he could dig deeper. He needed more room. There was no telling how many corpses were buried under this house. As David's story went on, it was clear that he was becoming more unstable. He talked about how he cut off everyone he knew and he hadn't left the house for years. But it didn't matter. The dead didn't stop. He started to find them when he awoke each morning. Sometimes he'd even hear them walking around the house during the twilight morning hours, only for them to fall with a thud when he was truly and fully alert. What finally sparked him to action was the morning he awoke with his hands around his throat. The body the hands belonged to didn't die for a solid minute after David had opened his eyes. David tried everything he could to think of to stop the house. He drove hundreds of miles away, but found that after going to sleep, he would always wake up back inside the house, with extra corpses to clean up for his trouble. He then tried lighting the house on fire and found it just wouldn't light, not even the curtains. One desperate night, he took a sledgehammer to the wall, only for the metal head to crack and break when it struck the wooden walls. Ultimately, David fell victim to the house. David's demise isn't covered in the notebooks. He stopped writing sometime before his death. The last entry talks of how he'd planned to bury the notebook in the basement with the dead bodies. This was the only place he could think of that future owners might find it. If he left it out in the open, surely any responsible realtor would have thrown it away. When I was being shown the house, the realtor told me about David's death. It was the reason the house was so cheap. After all, who wants to buy a home that someone has died in? Blunt trauma to the head. The official says that he fell down the stairs and died from the numerous blows his head took along the way. Maybe it's true and he simply slipped. Or he could have been pushed by one of those things that now walk my halls when I sleep. I like to think that he escaped. That the David they found at the bottom of the stairs was just another corpse created by the house. But I know in my heart that isn't true. I don't know how much longer I have. I can't leave. The house fully has me within its grasp. But I'm not done fighting. I just don't think I can fight it on my own. David tried to help. He laid out everything that he had learned about the house, but the information got to me too late. That's why I'm putting it all out there here and now. No one can say I didn't warn them about what they were getting into. You know the risks. Looking for roommates. Only serious applicants need apply.